Hello, my name is Mitch Kashoon, and I have the pleasure of helping to lead you through this workshop of 400 years covering the history of ideas and practices and policies about race in American society and culture. You can see my credentials on the left side of the screen. I've been working in the field of African American history for the past 30 years or so. And yet people often ask me why I came to focus on African American history as my specialization in the historical profession. And really, I didn't set out to focus on African American history. I knew I was interested in American history and culture. But as I started my graduate studies, the more I read, the more I wrote, the more I researched, the more I discussed ideas with my colleagues, the more it became apparent to me that one cannot really understand the history of the United States of America and everything that led up to it without understanding the presence, the experiences, the actions of African and African descended people. And this has been the case from the very beginning, from the earliest moments of colonial settlement, all the way certainly up to the present, and will continue to be a central defining characteristic of American society well into the future. This presentation is going to cover 400 years, approximately, of racial ideas, policies, and practices in the U.S., with a particular focus on African Americans' experiences. The presentation is broken up into 5 different segments, 5 of these PowerPoint segments. Each will be somewhere around 40 to 60 minutes long. They'll vary a bit. And all of these segments are going to be focused on excerpts from documentary films that I've used in my teaching and that I think offer valuable perspectives on the ways in which race has operated in American society. We'll proceed chronologically through this history. The documentary clips will be interspersed with some contextual material, some PowerPoint slides that have bullet points or images that present some other historical information, contextual material, that I think helps to frame the material presented in the PowerPoints. There will also be some short video clips of me, like this one, that will sort of talk through some of the main points of the videos so you can see the things that I would like to emphasize. I'll try to make some connections to keep us focused on the workshop's focus, and we'll get to that in a moment. Address questions that often come up. I do presentations like these live and in person as well, and we won't have the luxury of having a true interactive experience, which I think is really the most valuable and useful way to work through some difficult material like this. So I encourage you to watch these presentations with friends or family members or coworkers, or if you can't watch them together, agree to watch them separately and then come together later to discuss your ideas about the material. Write down notes as you're watching these video excerpts and throughout the process. I think journaling is a good way to keep track of your thinking. We're going to be working through about 5 hours worth of material here, and by the fifth hour, you're going to forget some of the things that you saw in the early segments. So I encourage you to take notes, maintain a journal, just, whatever, questions that come up, the thoughts that you have about the material, things you find troubling, personal experiences that somehow relate to what you're watching. All these things can be useful, and that way you won't forget some of the thoughts that you've had along the way, and you can see how your thinking has developed over the course of this workshop. So please consider that. And again, discussing the material with others is really important, I think, in gaining a better understanding of this really challenging material, some of which can be quite troubling. For example, there will be some occasional images of lynchings or other forms of racial violence. Some language will be quite disturbing, including the occasional use in the documentaries, not by me, of the N-word. I've inserted trigger warnings in the PowerPoints when these things are coming up, but I want to let you know in advance to be prepared for some really disturbing images and disturbing language. In any case, sharing your thoughts about this history with others can be a very useful way to work through things that you find especially disturbing, things you don't fully understand, and so on. So the essential question that we're going to be addressing, and this appears on the next PowerPoint slide, is how have policies, practices, and ideas about race and about African descended people shaped 400 years of American history and shaped our current struggles for racial equity. So I really want you to think not just about the history, that's important in and of itself, but not just about the history, more importantly, about how that history has led us to where we are today in American society with regard to racial policies, racial practices, and ideas about race. Understanding how we got to where we are is crucial to developing effective strategies to move forward, to improve things for the coming generations, to address issues of racial inequity in American society today. In covering 400 years of American racial history in a relatively short time frame, we obviously can't address every possible topic. There's going to be a lot that we leave out. But what I have tried to do is provide a broad framework that suggests the systematic ways in which racial ideas, racial policies, and racial practices have become deeply entrenched in American history and culture. And really, as far as I'm concerned, every aspect of American society, culture, economics, politics, has been deeply affected and fundamentally shaped by the way that we have made race operate in the society over these past centuries. At the very end of this 5-part presentation, I have a PowerPoint slide that has a list of selected readings and documentaries that I think are very useful for those of you who want to go more deeply into some of this subject matter. You'll find a good starting place there, and certainly that's not an exhaustive list either. So we're going to cover a lot of information. We'll address some very troubling aspects of American history that K-12 education in this country generally doesn't address and often overlooks, and quite frankly, even university level education often overlooks. I'm excited to be doing this, and I hope you are too. So let's get started. Okay, let's get started. And I think a constructive place to start thinking about race and racial policies and racial ideas in the Americas is with the transatlantic slave trade. This really began in the 1400s, very, very small, slow pace at first, as first the Portuguese, and then later in the 1500s and 1600s, other European powers began to make contact with Africans along the West Coast. The map that you see here indicates the locations from which the vast majority of enslaved Africans were taken and brought across the Atlantic into these plantation societies in the New World, in North and South America and the Caribbean. First thing I want to point out is scale. From the topmost arrow on the west coast of Africa there, the little arrow coming from what is now the country of Senegal, or that region, down to that very thick arrow at the bottom of the left side around the location of the country of Angola today, that is roughly 4,000 miles of coastline. It's a vast expanse. And the people along this coastline had many, many, many different forms of society, many different political organizations, many different levels of government organization and military capability. They spoke hundreds of different distinct languages that were mutually unintelligible. They did not identify themselves as Africans. They were Mende, they were Wolof, they were Bakongo, and the whole vast variety of ethnic and linguistic divisions. So this is a very diverse group of people. The enslavement began in the 1400s, primarily, and you can see this in those arrows, that the thickness of the arrows suggests the volume, the numbers of people going to particular places, coming from particular places in West Africa and going to particular places in North and South America. And you can see that skinny little line at the top going into North America represents about 400,000 or 500,000 people over the course of several hundred years who were brought from Africa directly into the English colonies in North America. Just a trickle compared to the vast numbers coming into especially Brazil on the east coast of South America, where the Portuguese had established a colony that was relying on the cultivation of sugar for its income, and lots of little arrows breaking up into the Caribbean there. The overwhelming majority of enslaved Africans were forcibly transported into the Caribbean or into Brazil, primarily for the cultivation of sugar. Sugar was a luxury crop, hard to get in England and other parts of Europe. And they felt that growing this crop successfully would provide, they would have ready-made markets for it. It would be a great source of income. And the climate and terrain in the Caribbean islands and in Brazil were ideal for sugar cultivation. The problem that they had was labor. Attempted to enslave the native populations, but they either fled to the interior, resisted in one way or another, or died out from European diseases. There weren't enough European immigrants to provide a substantial labor force, and this was brutalizing labor as well that a lot of Europeans didn't want to do. Enslaving Africans and bringing them in to serve as a labor force was the initial origin of the transatlantic slave trade. It grew gradually over the centuries, peaking in the 1700s, when you had probably 6 million coming in that century alone. So another thing that I want to touch on is the differences between the unfree status experienced by people in African societies and transatlantic slavery. People often say, well, the Africans sold each other they sold their own people into slavery, and they had slavery themselves, so it wasn't really the Europeans' fault. Well, that's only marginally true. The kind of unfreedom that Africans experienced within their own societies was fundamentally of a different nature than what we call slavery in the Americas, what we understand as slavery. In West African societies, people often found themselves in an unfree status if they were captured in war. War captives often became slaves. People who had debts they could not pay would be enslaved until that debt was paid off. People had committed crimes against the community of one kind or another would be enslaved for a period of time in order to pay for those crimes. So slavery in these societies was almost never a lifelong situation. It was something, large numbers of people became free. Even while enslaved, these people were integrated into society. They could own land, they could own property, they could attain positions of influence within the society, particularly if they had skills like literacy or knowledge of particular kinds of trades. They could marry and have children, and their children would be born free. And usually enslavement was for some kind of payment of a debt or for being captured in war. It was not primarily or typically for labor exploitation. So when we compare this with what we see in the Americas, as slavery gradually develops as an institution over a period of time from the 1400s through the 16 and 1700s, it was fundamentally an institution that was used to exploit labor for profit. That was the sole purpose of that slave trade, is to bring a controllable labor force into those sugar fields, and then later on in other colonies, in tobacco fields, in coffee, in rice and indigo fields, and so on. Slavery here was based on race. The concept of race, in fact, was invented in order to justify the differentiation of these African peoples and to make an argument for their suitability for enslavement. This was a structure that the Europeans developed in order to rationalize what they were doing in exploiting the labor of these people by depriving them of their freedom and the attempts to really deprive them of their humanity. So the slavery that developed was not treating people as integrated in society, but treating people as property, as chattel. It was intended to be a dehumanizing institution. People brought from Africa were not permitted to speak their languages, to use their own names. They had to adapt to the languages and customs and even religious practices of the enslavers. Slavery has been referred to by sociologists who study this as a kind of social death. They were not integrated in society. This was a lifelong condition. Very rarely would people become free in the colonial period, especially. It was a lifelong situation. It was hereditary. Children would inherit the status of slave. And there were large numbers of people in a society who were enslaved. It was, in many cases, the fundamental labor force of that society, in what we call a slave society. In the plantation societies of Brazil, the Caribbean, parts of North America, enslaved Africans outnumbered Europeans, sometimes 2 to 1, sometimes 5 to 1. Sometimes 90% of the population of a given colony would be made up of enslaved Africans, with a small number of Europeans there who were heavily armed, and the Africans being heavily monitored in order to maintain this institution. So it was a whole relentless process. It was a relentlessly and ruthlessly efficient system, as one historian of the slave trade has referred to it. And it was intended to dehumanize these people, to transform them into property, to sort of extinguish their sense of humanity. They could never accomplish this fully. People maintained their sense of humanity and their dignity as best they could under these trying circumstances. But that was the intent of this enslavement. And that's what makes transatlantic slavery so fundamentally different from any kinds of unfree labor that existed either in Europe or Africa or other parts of the old world. Exploitation of labor, race-based, hereditary, lifelong, dehumanizing, and dominating the social, political, and economic structures of the society where they took root. One final point I want to mention about this idea of Africans selling their own people into bondage, enslaving each other. As Europeans, initially the Portuguese and later others, started to use racial slavery as an institution, yes, they purchased human beings from Africans. The Africans really didn't have a sense of what they were selling these people into. And they weren't selling their own people. They were often selling their enemies. They would go on raids into the interior, make war against an enemy tribe because they knew they could trade them to the Europeans and get guns, all kinds of finery, and increase their power and status. So a tiny minority of the upper crust of African societies benefited from the slave trade. And I use the analogy of, the thing about a frog in a pot of boiling water. If you throw that frog in a pot of boiling water, he's going to jump out as quick as he can. But if you just put a frog in a pot of water and gradually increase the heat, the frog doesn't quite realize what's happening until it's too late. And in a sense, that's the way the Europeans entrenched racial slavery and the vast volume of the slave trade into these West African kingdoms and empires and smaller societies as well, is by the time they realized what was happening, they had the leaders were too invested in the system to get out of it. And this is the beginnings of Europeans' really disinvestment in Africa, and the continent has suffered immensely in the hundreds of years since that time. Okay, so let's move on to the first video excerpt that we're going to show that deals not with the slave trade, but with the way slavery took root in one particular colony in North America, in Virginia. The first documentary that we're going to look at here is called Africans in America. This is a really wonderful series. It's a 4-part documentary of 4 approximately 1 hour episodes. And we're going to watch a short excerpt, about 8 minutes or so, from the first episode, and it's referred to as the terrible transformation. You'll see why as we get into this clip and the next one from the same series. This is a documentary that traces slavery in North America, primarily the British colonies in what would become the United States, and then in the U.S. itself. What I want you to focus on in this particular episode, you can see a few points at the left here. There is a difference between indentured servitude and racial slavery. And this relates to something that a lot of people who I talk to will make some kind of comment like, well, the Irish were enslaved in America too. My ancestors were slaves in the Americas. And so how is that different from the experience of the Africans? Well, in fact, as the bullet point on the previous slide indicated, no European person ever held the legal status of slave in the British American colonies. It was a fundamentally different institution in which people provided unfree labor and under the system of indentured servitude. And that's going to be discussed in this first video excerpt. And I want you to pay particular attention to someone who's introduced in the first couple of minutes of this episode, referred to as Antonio and then as Anthony Johnson. And his experience, I think, raises some interesting questions about the nature of race, the nature of race relations, the nature of freedom and unfreedom in the very beginnings of the English colonial enterprise in North America, and here in the colony of Virginia. So as you're watching this short episode, again, the idea of journaling or just note-taking, I think, is a good one. As thoughts occur to you, just have a notebook open or a laptop open, whatever you want to do. Make some notes, questions that you have that weren't answered in the video, or topics that you think you'd like to explore further, or things that really surprised you. I find this a useful way myself when I'm looking at something and be able to remember what I'm thinking about it. So please take advantage of that. So if I'm going to stop this here, you go on to the next slide and click the arrow in the bottom left to begin the video. It's about 8.5 minutes long, and then I'll be back and talk a little bit about what we've seen.
About the latter end of August, a Dutch man of war arrived at Point Comfort. The commander's name, Captain Jope. He brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor bought in exchange for food. John Rolfe, Virginia colonist.
In 1619, a year before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, a mystery ship appeared out of a violent storm off the Virginia coast. No one recorded the ship's name, but somewhere on the high seas, she had robbed a Spanish vessel of a cargo of Africans. In search of supplies, she traded the Africans for food. They had been baptized and given Christian names. As Christians, they could not be enslaved for life under English law. Like most Europeans in the colony, they were purchased to work as servants for a limited number of years. The new arrival supplied much-needed labor for the tobacco crop that was making men rich. Settlers were planting tobacco in the streets of Jamestown, carving plantations out of the surrounding wilderness, and shipping some 60,000 pounds a year back to England.
Once tobacco is established as a viable commodity, then the more land you control, the bigger profits you can make. And in order to make those profits, you need more labor, and you look for that labor wherever you can find it.
Well, the colony builders initially intended to rely almost exclusively on white indentured servants as a labor force to cultivate the crops that were being grown in Virginia, principally tobacco. And in order to create these raw materials or goods, you often needed labor.
Here's a how to the company and one to my life.
The world the Africans entered was controlled by wealthy Englishmen and populated by the English poor, most under the age of 25. In return for passage to Virginia, They had traded 4 to 7 years of their labor. They were bound to a master by an indenture form, a contract that defined length of service and the conditions of servitude. Most were promised freedom dues after their service, a bushel of corn, a new suit of clothes, and 100 acres of land. Under Virginia's head right system, a planter was entitled to 50 acres of land where each servant brought into the colony.
The issue always was how long that indenture would be and under what conditions you would be forced to work. At its best, it was a short, friendly apprenticeship. At its worst, it was a long and exploitative situation in which you might die before you ever obtained your freedom.
By 1622, 3,000 new settlers drawn by the opportunities of the tobacco boom had arrived in Virginia. 2 years later, the first Negro child was born in the colony. He was named William Tucker, after a Virginia planter. The prosperity that began in 1619 and the dream of a new Eden, of people peacefully coexisting under English law, was seriously threatened in March 1622. On Good Friday, some 30 nations of the Powhatan Confederacy, angered by English violation of land treaties, attacked without warning and attempted to drive the English back into the sea. Along the James River, the Indians killed 350 colonists. On the Bennett plantation alone, 52 people died. Among the 12 who survived was a man named Antonio.
Here's an individual that arrives as one of the first African Americans in the history of what became the United States. He does what almost no one in early Virginia managed to do, and that is live. Everyone that's dying of disease, of violence, and in a sense he's lucky.
He had been brought to the colony the year before to work tobacco along the James River. His name appeared in the 1625 Virginia census as Antonio a Negro. He was listed as a servant.
He comes to Virginia, he finds a society that is just developing. He's getting in on the ground floor, as it were. I don't know if he was able to immediately envision that there would be opportunities for him here that weren't available elsewhere. I don't know that anyone could have foretold that.
When Antonio arrived, the laws of Virginia did not as yet define racial slavery. They governed only the status of servants. At some point, Antonio changed his name to Anthony Johnson and married a Negro servant named Mary from a neighboring plantation. She bore him 4 children. By 1640, it is clear Anthony and Mary were no longer servants. They had acquired their own modest estate on Virginia's eastern shore.
As Johnson prospered, as he obtained land and cattle, he also acquired dependent laborers. What made all of this society go was property. Your identity in the society was determined rather obviously by the amount of land, the amount of labor that you owned.
Anthony Johnson was enjoying privileges belonging to a free Englishman. He claimed 5 workers as headrights and expanded his property to 250 acres along the Pongateak Creek. At least some of his workers were white. By 1650, Anthony was one of 400 black people in Virginia out of a population of almost 19,000 settlers. In Northampton County, where Johnson lived, nearly 20 African men and women were free, and 13 owned their own homes.
As Anthony Johnson is accumulating property, It seems as though his situation is secure. You get a sense of this individual, this black man, being treated like any white planter, and his wife and daughters being treated like the wife of a planter.
At an early moment when men and women were sorting themselves out, when the rules, the etiquette of race, labor, were not so clear. At this moment, in one county in Virginia, it was not foreordained that race relations would become what they did become.
So, Anthony Johnson, someone who is brought probably from the colony of Angola, based on the name Antonio, an Hispanic-sounding name, and the Portuguese had control of the trade coming out of the Angola and Congo regions of Southwest Africa. And we know that it was a Portuguese ship that the Dutch man-of-war captured its cargo of enslaved Africans, and ended up bringing them to Virginia just because they needed supplies. And they were able to trade these people. The Virginians needed labor, these people needed supplies, and so on. Anthony Johnson, Antonio, didn't come in on that first ship in 1619. He came in a few years later. And I should say that this particular documentary, which is an outstanding piece of scholarship and is a beautiful presentation as well, it was from 1998. Since that time, historians have found additional sources that suggest that quite a number of Africans who were forcibly brought into the colony of Virginia as early as the 1620s were indeed assigned the status of slave, a lifelong hereditary institution. The hereditary part wasn't quite worked out yet. So the timing is interesting here. Clearly, racial slavery as a labor exploitation institution was well established in Brazil and in parts of the Caribbean by the time Anthony Johnson arrives in the 1620s, especially in Brazil. So the Europeans broadly knew about racial slavery. But as was pointed out in the video, the laws did not yet define racial slavery as an institution in colonial Virginia. So the status of these Africans was somewhat fluid. And certainly in the case of Johnson and a number of other people who lived near him on Virginia's eastern shore, people of color, people of African descent, owned property, owned their own homes, were working the land, owned labor. And when I say owned labor, not necessarily owning human beings as chattel, but controlling indentured servitude. So that's what the people who were indentured servants were not owned. They were not property. Their labor was owned for the period of that contract. And that seems to be the situation that Anthony Johnson and a number of other Africans found themselves in. So by 1650, we see Johnson, as they indicate here, living the life of an English planter, his wife, his family having all the rights of a planter. There's documentation of him taking people to court and having judgments found in his favor when there was a dispute over land or property or something like that. So Anthony Johnson was integrated into the community, and he was establishing himself as having a secure status. The next documentary excerpt is something that will describe how this situation changes over the course of the second half of the 1600s. And I do want you to pay close attention to law. The laws of colonial Virginia begin to change. New laws are established specifically relating to Africans, designating them as a specific group of people, differentiating them from other groups of people with different crimes, different kinds of statuses, different kinds of punishments. And this is the beginnings of the establishment of a true racial order in the colony of Virginia. Now, as I said before, things happen at different rates at different times. Slavery being established as a legal institution happened earlier in some colonies, later in others. The nature of the work that the enslaved people did was different in different colonies. So this is dealing just with Virginia in the 1600s, but I think it's very indicative of the kinds of ways that racial slavery begins to incorporate itself into colonial American society. And along with it, ideas about race, ideas that differentiate African peoples as being somehow different from people of European ancestry. And that's going to be something that it plants the seed of the kinds of racial relations that ended up evolving in North America. And it's an interesting thing to speculate. Some people were very surprised that someone like Anthony Johnson could exist in colonial Virginia. But again, slavery was an institution that was built gradually over time. And it was not something that was just imposed all at once in every colony, in every place. And this is, again, tracks the Virginia experience. So I'll leave it at that. Pay attention to the laws that are passed here. Think about questions that arise as you look at some of these events and what transpires. And I'll talk a little bit more after this next video excerpt. It's about 10 minutes long. So go to the next slide, click that arrow on the video, and after you're done watching, go to the following slide, and I'll visit with you there and talk about some of the things that we've seen.
In 1640, the year Anthony Johnson purchased his first piece of land, 3 servants had run away from a Virginia plantation and headed for Maryland. Captured and returned to their owner, they were tried for breaking their contract.
The said 3 servants shall receive the punishment of whipping and to have 30 stripes apiece. One called Victor, a Dutchman, the other a Scotchman called James Gregory, shall first serve out their times according to their indentures, and 1 whole year apiece after, and after that to serve the colony for 3 whole years apiece. The third, being a Negro named John Punch, shall serve his said master or his assigns for the time of his natural life. Jamestown Court Recorder.
The time of his natural life. According to all the legal records that survive, no white servant in America ever received such a sentence.
So what begins to happen in the 1640s is that those who are controlling the Virginia colony say to themselves, the fluidity that we've seen in the past, the fluidity that has allowed an Anthony Johnson to serve less than a life term, to acquire his own piece of ground, to develop a free status, is not something that we want to project as going further in the future. We want to close down that opportunity. We want to begin to show some distinctions.
The English definition of who could be enslaved began to shift from non-Christian to non-white. For Anthony and other Africans in America, the idea of an equal chance in the colonies was now under attack. In 1641, Massachusetts became the first colony on the British American mainland to recognize slavery as a legal institution. Connecticut followed in 1650, Maryland in 1663, New York and New Jersey in 1664. Virginia legally recognized slavery in 1661, and a year later, a Virginia court decided that all children born in the colony would be free or slave according to the condition of the mother. In Virginia, slavery would be defined by race and perpetuated through heredity.
Perhaps in the middle of the 17th century, if you were one of several thousand Africans living in Virginia, you certainly knew that your children would be free. You might have that expectation. And to suddenly find themselves involved in lifelong servitude and then to realize that in fact their children might inherit the same status, that was a terrible blow. That was a terrible transformation.
I looked in the east, I looked in the west.
For the first 50 years of the colony, most of the unfree labor force had been European, but that was about to change. Word of the hard life in Virginia had gotten back to England, and the colonial government faced a growing shortage of servant labor. Also troubling the colony were the thousands of free men, most former indentured servants, who were unemployed and roaming the countryside.
About slavery and Horace to a garden.
The problem they face is not only a decreasing supply of indentured servants, but they face this increasing problem of what to do with all these indentured servants once they live out their term, and a lot of them were surviving. They had to be given land, they had to be given their freedom dues, and one of those dues included even guns, and there was a lot of unrest in Virginia.
In 1661, servants rebelled in York County. 2 years later, Gloucester County authorities foiled a plot by 9 servants to steal arms and ammunition and march on the seat of colonial government. In 1676, the unrest in Virginia exploded into civil war. An army of 500, free men, servants, and slaves rebelled against the colonial establishment's restriction on available lands. They attacked peaceful Indians, ransacked property, and burned Jamestown, sending the governor into hiding.
This disorder that the indentured servant system had created made racial slavery to Southern slaveholders much more attractive, because what were black slaves now? Well, they were a permanent, dependent labor force who could be defined as a people set apart. They were racially set apart. They were outsiders. They were strangers. And in many ways, throughout the world, with a couple possible exceptions, slavery has taken root especially well when the people who are enslaved are defined as strangers, as outsiders, and can therefore be put into an inheritable, permanent status of slavery.
I understand there are some slave ships expected into York River now every day. I desire you to buy me 5 or 6 slaves, whereof 3 or 4 to be boys, a man and a woman. The boys from 8 to 17 or 18, the rest as young as you can procure them. William Fitzhugh, Virginia Planter, 1681.
Few ships coming from Africa made the voyage beyond the Caribbean to sell their cargoes on the mainland of British America. In 1672, the King of England chartered the Royal African Company, encouraging it to expand the British slave trade. Shareholders included 15 English lords and 25 sheriffs, the governor of Virginia, and John Locke, the philosopher of liberty. In its first 16 years, the company transported nearly 90,000 Africans to the Americas.
In the last decade of the 17th century, it was possible to imagine that in a single year, the number of new Africans arriving would equal the total black population in the colony, or close to it. These were men and women that had no sense of the world they were getting into, and they seemed to whites as very alien, foreign, unknowable.
The Europeans look upon these people and they project an image on them. They project an identity, and that identity is African. What that means is non-American. What that means is non-European. What that means is separation.
All servants imported and brought into this country who are not Christian in their native land shall be counted and be slaves. If any slave resists his master correcting such slave, and shall happen to be killed in such, it shall not be accounted felony. If any Negro shall absent himself from his master's service and lie hid and lurking, and if he shall resist any person employed to apprehend the said Negro, then it shall be lawful for such person to kill the said Negro. Virginia General Assembly, June 1680.
We think about slavery as this complete package. It just came to evil landowners, and it didn't happen that way. It happened one law at a time, one person at a time. And as landowners felt the need to control a different behavior, year after year, they added more laws until finally 1691, they passed the law that made it illegal to free a black slave unless they were leaving the colony. So by then, it was pretty much set that this was going to be a slave society.
To move from indentured servitude to racial slavery means that they're setting their own history on a course where freedom is going to depend on slavery, where the political economy of a major portion of these colonies is going to depend on slavery, where the freedom of some is going to depend on the bondage of others. It means that the American colonies, this jewel of the British Empire, is living this contradictory history now of a society that is increasingly rooted in a labor system that's human bondage, that's racial slavery.
Well, as you can see, things changed pretty dramatically over the second half of the 1600s. From the status of Anthony Johnson and others like him of being property owners, controlling land, controlling labor, having rights in the courts and so on, gradually over time, little by little, as the one commentator mentioned, one law at a time, one person at a time, the opportunities that people like Anthony Johnson had were shut down for other people of African descent. In terms of Anthony Johnson's family, an extension of this video that I'm not going to show touches on what happens to him. In essence, Anthony Johnson dies and leaves his property to his sons, and they have each smaller portions of land. Over time, his sons lose their land, lose their status. One of the things that's difficult about studying this history is the lack of records. There are a lot of records. We rely on a lot of records. There are a lot of laws that you see, you heard cited in the documentary there. And you can see on the left here a law from 1705. So lots has survived, but lots has not survived. So we're not really sure what happened to Anthony Johnson's descendants. We are sure that by the beginning of the 1700s, they had lost their land and more than likely had lost their freedom. Either they had left the colony or had died or had been enslaved within the colony. And they had little recourse based on the changes in the legal structure that took place across that period. So we see in this second half of the 1600s in Virginia, the ways in which racial hierarchies begin to be inscribed into law. There's a clear separation between European or Christian or white. The terminology is kind of fuzzy and sometimes interchangeable, and black or African. That's a fundamental distinction that now exists. And it affects legal rights, marriages, property ownership, status, opportunities, etc. Especially after an event called Bacon's Rebellion, we see these laws changing. They didn't name it in that video excerpt, but when they talked about that rebellion, in effect, civil war in 1676, where hundreds of slaves, freemen, and indentured servants banded together to try to overthrow the government of Virginia over a whole set of issues dealing with Native American relations and property rights and so on, there was this alliance among the lower classes, both black and white servants and enslaved Africans, saw that they had interests in common. They intermixed with each other. They intermarried with each other to some degree. There were sexual relations, creating a mixed race population in the lower classes. And they socialized with each other in taverns. They worked together side by side in the fields. So there was a lot of interaction on a fairly equal basis between lower class whites and blacks who were both laboring to secure their existence in this new world. After Bacon's Rebellion, after that 1676 rebellion, the leaders in the colony recognized that this cross-racial alliance among the lower classes posed a serious threat to the whole social order that they had established and which they were in charge of. And that is a big part of the reason you begin to see these racialized laws differentiating between white and black in terms of rights, punishments, crimes, and so on. And it's a way of giving lower class whites, people who are not even free yet, who are still indentured servants, giving them a stake in the society, giving them a stake in being white. So these racial distinctions become ever more important as the legal structure begins to make distinctions in how people are treated. And you can see in the list on the left here, what happened in 1705. They rattled off a whole bunch of laws from the 1660s and 70s and 80s and so on. In that video excerpt. In 1705, there was an attempt by the Virginia legislature to sort of put all this together into one package and a whole set of laws referred to generally as an act concerning servants and slaves. Who had what rights, who didn't have other rights. And you can see here that that the Negro and mulatto categories are the folks who have much more severe punishments. Their death is, if it's deemed justified in subduing someone who had run away, their death was not a felony. It would not be constituted any crime whatsoever. Compensation for the loss of the life of that slave would be made to the owner of that slave. So this system is really entrenching that racial hierarchy. It's making the lives of black people basically expendable, as long as the slaveholders are compensated for the loss of their property. So it becomes a different sort of society, and what historians would refer to as a slave society, a society in which the labor of the society is increasingly put upon the backs of people who are in the status of slave. Blacks in colonial Virginia by the early 1700s were by and large all enslaved people. If a person became free, he or she was required to leave the colony or risk being re-enslaved. There were probably a handful here and there of free black people in colonial Virginia, but their status was always tentative and their situation was always under threat. So this became a white-dominated society where enslaved people, people of African descent, were by and large considered property. And that is a fundamental step that other colonies are taking as well. By the early 1700s, all the colonies in North America of the British had racial slavery as an institution. Georgia was not added as a colony until several decades into the 1700s. Slavery was a fundamental part of Georgia's identity as well. So these are the kind of things that are now taking shape, where race matters immensely, where definitions of racial identity are now being thought about a lot more and being inscribed into law. And that creates some fundamental baseline for the way ideas, practices, and policies about race began to take shape in the 1700s. And that's what I want to talk about on the next slide. I want to talk about some of the things that are affecting colonial American society as we move into the 1700s. As a labor exploitation institution, race-based labor exploitation is firmly established in all of those colonies. There are dramatic differences in the place that slavery as an institution held in these different colonies. There were dramatic differences in the kind of economies these colonies had and the extent to which they relied on slave labor. And it was primarily the colonies in the southern part of eastern North America, the Carolinas, Virginia, and Maryland, where slavery became a very deeply entrenched institution, where the labor of enslaved Africans was the fundamental labor source of the society. And certainly by the early 1700s, we can see all of these southernmost colonies as being slave societies, where slavery was the most fundamental labor source, and it became extremely important for those people in those societies to maintain those strict and rigid hierarchies. In places like Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, enslaved Africans made up a small percentage of the population, single digits, 3%, 5%. In places like New York and Pennsylvania, New Jersey, there was a somewhat heavier reliance on slave labor, especially in the Hudson River Valley in New York and in New York City itself. Probably 10% of New York's population in the mid-1700s was made up of enslaved Africans. So there were significant numbers of enslaved Africans in the northern colonies as well. But it was really in the South where the long growing season and the reliance on plantation agriculture of tobacco in Virginia and Maryland, of rice and indigo in South Carolina. Notice I'm not saying cotton. Cotton was really not a part of the colonial American economy at all. That happens in the early 1800s. We'll maybe talk about that a little bit later. And it has obviously profound effects on the institution of slavery and the experience of enslaved African Americans. The statistics I have here on the left, I think, are important in just understanding the broad context of what British North American colonial life was like. Well, not so much what life was like, but who was there. So in 1700, about 300,000 people. By 1775, at the verge of the American Revolution, about 2.5 million. So remarkable growth. The growth here is much faster than the population growth in England or other places in the Old World. But the population of Africans is the population that is increasing the most dramatically. You can see that breakdown. In fact, by the time of the Revolution, the English made up barely half, not even quite half of the whole colonial population. The next largest group were Africans at 21%. So that by the time of the American Revolution, 1 out of every 5 Americans was of African birth or African descent. And that's something that I think surprises a lot of people who see colonial America as a very English place, a very white place. But when you look at it, and again, the numbers are dramatically different between, say, colonial Massachusetts, which had a preponderance of English settlers and only a few percentage points of African population, to South Carolina, where 2/3 of the population, over 60% of the population, were Africans. That has a profound influence on shaping the culture and the lifeways that are taking shape in that society. Those people are all enslaved, but they play fundamental roles in building the society, digging out the canals and watering the crops and tending the crops and cooking the food and dealing with every aspect of life in that emerging society. So as I say, the African population is growing quite dramatically. In 1700, they made up about 11% of the population, not too much different from the percentage of African Americans in American society in the 21st century. But by 1775, 21% of American colonists were of African descent. And you can see that the graph on the right side of the slide here indicates the growth of the slave trade across centuries. where relatively small numbers of Africans were enslaved and transported out of Africa in the 1400s and 1500s. You see an acceleration in the 1600s that really is reflected by what happens in Virginia, where by the end of the 1600s, you have significant numbers of Africans being imported directly into Virginia, slave ships landing every day in the James River, the York River. And in the 1700s, that dramatic increase on the graph here, and this applies not just to British North American colonies, but to across the Americas, roughly 6 million people forcibly brought from Africa into North and South America and the Caribbean during the 1700s, exclusively to provide a labor force, a controllable, identifiable labor force that could be depended on, and more could be transported as the years went on as you needed more labor. This was the nature of this brutal system. So the numbers on the left side of the slide here paint a picture of a colonial America that I think is somewhat different from what most of us entertain. Many parts of North America were very Africanized places, especially places like the Carolinas, Georgia, the coastal region at least of Georgia, and Virginia, where probably about a third of the population were people of African descent, and virtually all of them enslaved. That has significant role in shaping the nature of colonial life, the relations among people, and the relations among people were often ordered along the lines of a master-slave relationship. It was a hierarchical relationship. Husbands had authority over wives. Parents had authority over children. Masters had authority over indentured servants. The so-called better sort of people, those with aristocratic connections back in England, had authority over people of the lower orders, as they were called at the time. And absolutely, enslavers had authority over the enslaved Africans who built their wealth. So from the first arrival of Africans in 1619 in Virginia as enslaved people, or at least unfree people, we see this gradual growth across the 1600s that skyrockets in the 1700s as these colonies are thriving. And they are thriving economically because of the slave trade to a large degree. Certainly the production of tobacco, rice, and indigo in the southern colonies using enslaved people's labor was a fundamental source of the economic basis of those societies. But even in those northern colonies, people who did not use slave labor extensively, say in the town of Boston, the city of New York, the city of Philadelphia, enslaved people were there. They were doing labor in the town, but there are many other kinds of labor situations as well. A lot of free laborers going on, still indentured servitude going on. But the profits that people made who were invested in the slave trade were immense. So prominent wealthy people in New York, in Boston, in Providence, Rhode Island, were heavily invested in the slave trade, owned slave ships, bought shares in slave ships, and profited from that human trafficking. Even if people didn't profit from human trafficking directly, there were large investment banks beginning to take shape in the 1700s in New York City. And the investments there were rooted in slavery. The exchange of goods, things like corn and wheat that were grown in northern colonies like Pennsylvania and New York, were shipped into the Caribbean, to the English colonies in the Caribbean, because all those colonies in the Caribbean gave up virtually all their agricultural land to sugar, because that's where the profits were. So they had to import food to a large degree. And the profits coming into northern colonies like New York and Pennsylvania often were connected with selling grain products, food products, to enslavers in the Caribbean in order to feed their enslaved population. And manufacturing clothing for the enslaved population became an industry in itself by the late colonial period. So all of these people in all of these colonies were invested in one way or another in the enslavement of African people. And really, it's on the backs of enslaved Africans' labor that the American colonies were built, that they were made to prosper, and that they came to be on the verge of a revolution declaring their own independence. And we're going to, this is the end of this particular segment. The next segment will begin in that revolutionary area as we're exploring some of the ideas of how ideas and policies and practices about race and the status of African peoples in the Americas takes a different turn.